Escape from Alcatraz, Frank Morris and the Anglin Brothers, 1962. Please subscribe my channel, thanks. The route that prisoners took to Alcatraz was the same. The former U.S. Army fort first opened in 1859 to protect San Francisco's port from foreign invasion. It was converted from a U.S. Army prison into the ultimate maximum security federal prison, the world's most secure penitentiary, in 1934. The forbidding Fort-Knox-like environment, known as the Rock, sat on a lonely island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by nothing but icy waters of 48 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It would house such famous inmates as gangster Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz. Security included stronger iron bars, strategically placed guard towers, and a dozen rounds of prisoner head counts each day. Alcatraz had 336 cells but averaged about 260 prisoners who were there because of their behavior in other prisons, not their actual crimes. When they became too much to handle elsewhere, Alcatraz was their last stop. It was supposed to be impossible to escape, but some men did succeed. From 1934 until the prison's closing in 1963, 36 men made a total of 14 escape attempts. Most were either caught or died trying to escape, except for 3 men. Allen West, 29, arrived at Alcatraz in June 1958 for his second stint at the island prison. He was born in New York City on March 25, 1929, and his family moved to Georgia during the Great Depression. By the age of 14, West was serving time at the Georgia State Farm for boys for car theft. He escaped 3 times. Over the years, he would be repeatedly incarcerated in Georgia State Prison for car theft and burglary. He worked briefly as an electrician's helper and enlisted in the Army. He was arrested again soon after basic training and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was dishonorably discharged and transferred to a federal prison in Pennsylvania. After several incidents there, he was transferred to the federal maximum security U.S. penitentiary at Atlanta, Georgia. Along with Leavenworth, that penitentiary was the last stop before Alcatraz. West was released in October 1951 and arrested again in March 1952 on charges of breaking and entering and grand larceny. He escaped on December 26, 1952, and was picked up a month later in Mississippi after crossing state lines with a stolen vehicle. That netted him 5 years behind bars. He escaped from Mississippi and was arrested a month later for burglary in Texas. He was sentenced to another 5 years and sent to Atlanta in June 1953. After being segregated 4 times because of his behavior, prison officials sent him to Alcatraz in April 1954. He was eventually released but sent back to Alcatraz after being sentenced to 10 years for driving a stolen vehicle across the state line, a federal offense. The compulsively chatty West would be arrested 20 times over the course of his life and was involved in numerous escape attempts. Frank Lee Morris, 33, arrived in January 1960 after trying to escape from Atlanta, Georgia. He had been abandoned at birth and raised in a series of foster homes. He made repeated stints in reform school and was incarcerated in Louisiana's notorious Angola State Penitentiary. He was a bank burglar and escape artist who had 10 years left to serve in the super maximum security institution when he arrived at Alcatraz. While being transported to San Francisco by train, West and Morris had their handcuffs clamped to a padlock chain around their waist and they were shackled in leg irons. They were taken aboard the Warden Johnston, the boat to the island named for the first warden at Alcatraz. As the boat approached the shore, a sign on a cliff warned in large letters, "Keep OFF." Only government boats permitted within 200 yards. Persons entering closer without authorization do so at their own risk. Upon his arrival at Alcatraz, the boat's skipper locked the wheel and tied the key to the end of a line. The guard in the gun tower pulled up the key and kept it until the vessel was scheduled to leave again. The skipper retrieved the key once the guard was certain that the skipper was in command and all of Alcatraz's inmates had been accounted for. Prisoners boarded a waiting bus at the dock and went through a metal detector that was on board. A guard on duty at a higher tower watched as the bus climbed a narrow road, gears grinding as it managed steep hairpin turns to the top of island. A welcoming committee of guards holding rifles waited at the prison entrance. Prisoners had their handcuffs and leg irons removed, they were stripped, showered, examined, including a cavity search for contraband, and given a fresh set of prison garb. Cells measured 5 feet by 8 feet and were bare except for a cot, sink with one cold water faucet, toilet minus the lid and seat, and a small folding metal table and bench riveted into the wall. The back of the cell was made of concrete, and the bars on the front of the cell were the only place that allowed in light and air. Positioned near the bottom of the rear wall was a 6 by 10-inch metal ventilator grill, which was too small to crawl through even if it could be pried open. Despite some small variations, prison life had a routine quality to it. The alarm went off at 6 a.m., giving inmates 20 minutes to dress, wash up, brush their teeth, comb their hair, make their bed, and tidy the cell. A whistle blew and the men stood by the bars of their cell while the guards made a head count. The cell doors would slide open and men marched along the tier gallery and down a circular steel stairway to the mess hall. They had 20 minutes to eat breakfast before being marched back to their cells for another head count. Afterwards, they were marched out to the yard to work at their assigned job in one of the prison shops, which included clothing, glove, brush, furniture refinishing, laundry, or dry cleaning. A guard conducted a head count inside the shop every half hour. Inmates returned to their cells just after 4 p.m., after passing through a metal detector. One prisoner was randomly picked for a quick search and frisk for contraband that the detector had not picked up. Then prisoners took the stairs to their cells for another head count before dinner. As they ate their meals, prisoners faced each other across long tables. Guards patrolled, and silvery ornaments in the ceiling were really tear gas bombs that could be sprayed at the touch of a button if a disturbance broke out in the mess hall. After dinner, prisoners returned to their cells for one of the final head counts of the day. Lights went out 4 hours later, at 9:30 p.m. A guard would make another head count at 11:30 p.m., just after the shift change at midnight, and twice more before 7 a.m. when the day shift arrived. Guards had to be able to quickly and accurately count inmates throughout the day. They also needed to search a cell for contraband or hidden tools that could be used in an escape and be alert to the use of dummies to trick guards into believing an inmate was in their cell when, in fact, they weren't. Morris was assigned to a cell near West, whom he had met while they were both incarcerated at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and assigned a job making brooms in the brush shop. In October 1960, Morris was in the mess hall when he saw another familiar face. He had met brothers John, 32, and Clarence Anglin, 31, when they were serving time in the Atlanta penitentiary for bank robbery. They were from a poor family in Florida, where both men served time before being incarcerated in Georgia and Pennsylvania. In 1957, Clarence had escaped from prison for the 4th time. John had just finished a sentence for grand larceny. The two men and brother Alfred held up a bank in tiny Columbia, Alabama. They stole $19,000, but FBI agents caught them 4 days later in Ohio before they could spend it. John was sentenced to 10 years for the bank heist, while the other two received 15 years and were sent to the Atlanta prison to serve their time. They were eventually transferred to Leavenworth. Clarence tried to get John out of Leavenworth by cutting the top out of one big bread box and the bottom from another. John sat in one and Clarence placed loaves of bread on top before covering him with the other box. The delivery truck was about to haul John and the other boxes to a prison farm camp when a supervisor noticed 2 men struggling to hoist a heavier box onto the truck. John was transferred to the escape-proof Alcatraz. Clarence joined him in January 1961 and was given a cell beside his brother. West was in segregation for all but 49 days between December 1960 and May 1961. After his final stint, he was assigned to a cell near Morris, and only 4 down from the Anglin brothers. The men knew Alcatraz was not as escape-proof as it had been made out to be. On December 16, 1937, Oklahomans Ralph Rowe and Theodore Cole had made a break. Morris knew that there had to be a way off the island. He had heard a rumor that was circulating for years among the inmates. An unguarded utility corridor ran behind the rows of cells in Block B. The 3-foot-wide space was filled with water mains, sewer pipes, and electrical conduits feeding into each cell. The doors to the corridor were locked, but there were catwalks inside the corridor at the same height as each tier of cells to give plumbers and electricians access to the pipes. Ducts in the ceiling connected an air exhaust blower on top of the cell blocks to a large vent hood on the prison's roof. 7 other vents had previously been dismantled, and the openings sealed with bars and concrete. Since the vent still existed, Morris hoped that the remaining vent was not sealed with concrete. The ventilator shaft was 30 feet above Morris's head, but first he needed to access the utility corridor. With the fog that often descended around the island, tower guards using logs in the bay for target practice, and half-hour counts, Morris knew that a daytime escape was impossible, but perhaps he could flee under the cover of darkness. One evening while clipping his fingernails, Morris realized that the clipper he was holding had a little arm with a pointed edge that was used to clean dirt from under a nail. He got up from his bed and checked to make sure that the hallway outside his cell was empty. Then he went to the vent at the back of his cell and picked at the concrete on the edge of the vent's metal grill. A few grains fell to the ground. The next day Morris looked at the width of the utility door and figured that the wall behind the cells was about a foot thick. The vent in his cell created an opening that was 6 inches high and 10 inches wide, but Morris figured out that he needed a hole 10 inches high and 14 inches wide for him to squeeze through. Clearly, he needed more information about concrete and mortar, so he borrowed a book on structural engineering from the prison library. When inmates returned to their cells after supper, the cell block was filled with noise as some men practiced musical instruments. It was the perfect distraction that Morris needed to do his work. While West kept an eye out for guards, in cell 138 Morris chipped away at the cement around his vent until just before lights went out at 9:30 p.m. Each night, he plugged the hole with toilet paper and soap to conceal it. Morris let the Anglin brothers in on his plan. Clarence was particularly adept at escapes. Soon the brothers were also chipping away at their vents using the handles of spoons that they stole from the dining room. One person would chip away while the other was the lookout. Morris concealed his work by casually resting his accordion case against the vent. West placed his guitar, and John Anglin hung a raincoat. They worked away night after night, 7 days a week. The men realized that they would eventually make enough holes around the grill to be able to remove it. They would need to build a fake wall section to conceal their efforts to enlarge the hole enough to squeeze through. Morris made a papier-mâché picture of a grill to put over the real one. Clarence used a canvas artboard with diamond-shaped holes painted on and stuck an old tobacco box on the other side to hold it in place. When Clarence and Morris finished their holes, they became lookouts while West and John dug theirs. Once the men were able to access the utility corridor, they needed to make a raft, paddles, and life vests to escape the island and create dummies to ensure that guards would not immediately detect their escape during head counts and patrols. Clarence worked in the barber shop and collected discarded tufts of dark hair. He also agreed to take up painting and requested pink, white, and black paint along with brushes and canvas. The quartet ordered magazines from the library and cut out pages that had ads on both sides so that nobody would notice missing pages. Morris wet the pages in the basin of his cell and mixed them with the cement that he had removed from the wall, plaster, soap, and glue. He created a plaster that was molded into the shape of a head. Then he and Clarence experimented with colors until they found the right pigment to create a lifelike dummy. Their creations, nicknamed Oink and Oscar, were hidden inside the hole behind the fake grill at the back of their cells. Once the dummies were made, the men turned their attention towards building a raft and life vests. John, who worked in the clothing room in the basement, took to wearing a black raincoat as he returned to his cell from work each day. The guard coming on shift in the afternoon wasn't aware that John hadn't worn a raincoat to work in the morning. The plan was to cut up the raincoats to make a raft and life vests, but the men needed a place to hide the supplies that they were beginning to collect for their escape. They made their way down the utility corridor and climbed to the roof of their cell block, where they set up a secret workshop. While his brother Clarence kept an eye out for a guard, John snuck out through his vent and brought more than 50 raincoats to their secret hiding place. The March 1962 issue of Popular Science had an article about the top new designs in life vests. The men read it carefully and then stitched the seams of the raincoats together to make life vests and a rubber raft. They also built wooden paddles. In April 1962, Morris ordered a concertina. He dismantled the keys and converted the instrument into baffles to inflate the raft. The men also used their newfound access to the utility corridor to find a way out of the building. Using a network of pipes, they climbed up to the roof and eventually pried open the ventilator at the top of the shaft. They made a fake bolt to keep it in place until everything was ready. This would not have been possible had the prison taken a guard's suggestion to remove the catwalks and replace them with floors the width of the corridor. Their plan was helped along by a new seating configuration in the dining room. In July 1961, long 10-man tables had been replaced with smaller ones that seated 4 people each. Morris, West, and the Anglins sat together and discussed their preparations. In a cost-cutting measure in May 1962, the warden closed down the tower along the road from 4:45 p.m. to 8 a.m. The perch had given guards a sweeping view of the island, including the prison and its yard. In early June, guards searched the Anglin brothers' cells, but no evidence of their impending escape was found. West worried that he was next. His fake grill was not staying on properly, so he used cement particles to reduce the size of the hole. A week later the Anglins were ready to make their getaway. 5,000 miles away in Florida, Rachel Anglin wrote a letter to her sons on June 11. One of their sisters was getting married at the house in 5 days. On the West Coast, Morris and the Anglins ate their last meal on the Rock. At 5:30 p.m. everyone was back in the cells and the guard made a head count. The men in cells 138, 140, 150, and 152 were accounted for. A few hours later, the cons made their move. Morris rolled up 2 blankets and tucked them in his bed under the top blanket. He made an indentation in his pillow and placed Oscar, the dummy head, then tucked the blanket up under the chin, looked around his cell one last time, and then climbed out through the vent. He used a string to pull the accordion over the vent behind him and crawled into the utility corridor. The Anglins were waiting, but West could not get the hole in his vent open again. They would have to leave him behind. The 3 men gathered their vests, paddles, and the raft. They climbed out of the ventilator to the roof of the cell house and waited to hear sirens going off, but all they could hear were the sounds of inmates settling in for the night. They crawled along the roof, clutched an exhaust pipe, and shimmied 45 feet down the side of the building to the bottom. The pipe banged against the wall, making a noise that a guard inside the cell block thought came from the area of the hospital. He went there and stayed 30 to 45 minutes to keep an ear cocked for further hints as to where the sound was coming from, but he heard nothing further. The guard at the front gate had to stay at his post for the duration, so nobody was patrolling the grounds while the men were escaping. Meanwhile, seagulls squawked and circled overhead near the men. They scaled a 14-foot fence topped with barbed wire and crawled down a steep rocky cliff to the northeast shore of the island. As they looked out over the water, there were no lights to distinguish nearby Angel Island from the blackness of the night. They inflated their raft, carried it out to the water, and disappeared into the night towards Angel Island 1.5 miles away. It was the 13th escape attempt from Alcatraz, a number that was tattooed on Frank Morris's left index finger. West finally managed to break through his vent at 1:45 a.m. He climbed up to the roof and collected his life jacket. Looking out over the bay, he realized that the others had left without him. He climbed back down and returned to his cell. Ironically, a classification committee convened about 3 months earlier had commended him for good behavior. A frequent visitor to solitary confinement, he had managed to remain in the general population for nearly a year. The guards continued to complete their head counts throughout the night of the escape, but they failed to notice the 3 dummies. Inmates were roused from their sleep as usual the next morning. While doing a head count as the men stood by the bars of their cells, one guard had trouble waking up the Anglin brothers. He slapped one, only to see the dummy fly off the pillow and onto the floor. The flesh-tone dummies with real hair had fooled the night guards. At 7:15 a.m. on June 12, 1962, the prison went into lockdown and a siren alerted everyone on Alcatraz of an escape. An all-points bulletin was issued at 8 a.m., and an intensive search for the three began. The guards unlocked the men's empty cells and followed the trail from the fake grill to the utility corridor and the hole where ductwork should have been. They also found the men's stash of materials for their escape, including glue, a handmade periscope, and cut-up raincoats. A trail of footprints and scents that bloodhounds picked up led down to the beach. The guards found the paddle that the men had dropped during their escape and the life jacket for West, who would subsequently take credit in interviews for planning the escape. Authorities launched one of the largest manhunts since the Lindbergh kidnapping. The Bureau of Prisons in Washington, D.C., called in the U.S. Coast Guard, the California Highway Patrol, the U.S. Army, the State Harbor Police, and the police departments of San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, Tiburon, Sausalito, and San Rafael. An intensive air, sea, and land search was launched. The Coast Guard provided a helicopter and 4 patrol boats, and the U.S. Army sent 35 military police and more than 100 men from Fort Baker to Combe Angel Island for clues. FBI agents and 8 power cruisers searched the Marin County shoreline from Belvedere to the Golden Gate Bridge for several days. Other agents contacted boat owners in the area and people working along the shore to keep a lookout for the trio. FBI agents also conducted a door-to-door search in Sausalito and Tiburon while divers searched around Alcatraz. The FBI also checked the missing men's records and their previous escape attempts. They spent 2 weeks photographing evidence and interviewing prisoners and officers to piece together how 3 men had managed to plan an escape and assemble what they needed to follow through, under the unsuspecting noses of prison guards and officials. A paddle that matched the one found on the prison's roof was discovered on June 12 floating off Angel Island. FBI agents immediately wondered if the men had managed to reach their destination, but a thorough search turned up nothing. 2 days after the prison break, a boat belonging to the U.S. Corps of Engineers picked up 2 double-wrapped bags between Alcatraz and Angel Islands. They were made from black raincoats. Inside one of them were sheets of paper with a list of names and addresses, more than 60 photos of the Anglin family and friends, a letter addressed to Clarence, and a prison receipt for a $10 money order with his name on it. A homemade life vest like the one left behind for West at the prison washed up on Fort-Knox-like beach about 3 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge. Another life jacket turned up a week later. Both had a torn seam. Teeth marks were found on the second jacket's inflation tube, as though someone had tried to keep the jacket inflated with his teeth clenched to the tube. The FBI repaired and tested the jackets. They only remained inflated for an hour, while the airtight one for West stayed inflated for several hours. Morris and the Anglins had no money. West said that the plan was to steal clothes and a car once they reached land. Every robbery that occurred in Northern California for the next few weeks was carefully examined for signs of the prisoners, but nothing turned up. There were no reports of stolen boats or the vehicles. FBI agents interviewed the men's relatives for hints of their whereabouts, but the families didn't appear to have the financial means to support the men. During the time at which the men are believed to have launched their raft off the shore of Alcatraz, the water level in San Francisco Bay was at its peak within the 24-hour cycle of tides and water rushing out quickly towards the Pacific Ocean. Rowe and Cole escaped under similar circumstances in 1937, and their bodies never turned up. Did Morris and the Anglins make it across the bay, reach Angel Island, and then cross the strait into Marin County as planned? Or did they disappear under the weight of the wind and the waves? The raft never surfaced, and neither did any physical evidence linked to the men. The trio had vanished without a trace. Prison authorities believed that the men drowned, but none of the bodies turned up. In 1970, Rachel Anglin began proceedings to have her sons declared legally dead. The FBI remained active on the case for 17 years, until it was officially closed in 1979. Although Alcatraz had been slated for closure before the escape, the prison break accelerated its demise. It shut down on March 23, 1963, but not before John Paul Scott and Darrell D. Parker escaped on December 16, 1962. The men were later picked up and returned to Alcatraz. West was transferred from Alcatraz to a prison in Washington state on February 6, 1963, and then to Atlanta where he was released from federal prison on January 7, 1965. He continued to be in and out of prison, and he died of peritonitis at age 49 on December 21, 1978, after complaining of abdominal pains. A year later, actor Clint Eastwood starred as Morris in the 1979 film Escape from Alcatraz.